Honest J. Nowak. Oh yeah. A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to Honest J. Nowak, Mark of the Line. And more importantly, let's see where we can pretty much go from here on out. So I might as well break out the pad, because this time it's time to talk about yet another former American marque in the automotive industry that's had a pretty long series of successes and also failures. Number 726, Pontiac. Yeah, Pontiac. It's about time I pretty much start talking a bit more about that company, because you know what? It's had a pretty long history behind it. Pontiac, of course, has been defunct for 11 years now. But that is, of course, because of one specific reason. The 2007 to 2009 economic repression, which was simply called the recession by today's standards. Pontiac, of course, was one of actually a lot of victims during the recession that had managed to fall after, well, being one of a few others that have been selected by GM themselves. General Motors is practically the king of the automotive industry within the States. They do in fact own a lot of marques out there. Judging as far back as 2005, you could probably say that GM has had a huge share of different marques to choose from. From Chrysler, to Pontiac, to Hummer, to Jeep, Dodge, Ram, and eventually Fiat, and many others, pretty much. GM is probably one of the greatest that we might have ever had. Being the parent company of so many other marques out there that we've had throughout history, it almost makes you wonder, how could Pontiac, one of the greatest feats of engineering and also one of the best in the industry, fall pretty much overnight? Well, the answer is simple. By the mid to late 2000s, it had pretty much ended altogether. Sales were very low by that period in time. When the recession first hit in mid to late 2007, bam! GM went on ahead to close down at least 5 different marques in an attempt to try and regain certain profits. They were losing some because some of these companies were not necessarily doing as good as they used to. But GM did more than just decide on that. They decided to pretty much cancel the future of most of its own companies that probably could have turned out a lot better than it used to. The truth is, though, out of all companies that have been, well, snuffed out by GM themselves, Pontiac was probably one of the greatest in the industry that unfortunately had to be killed off, along with many others of its own brethren. GM, of course, made such a big decision in the automotive industry by 2010 that almost makes you wonder, what happened to these marques? Well, the truth is, if we look as far back as the 1940s, pretty much, with Pontiac's earliest points in history, some models out there, including the Chieftain, Deluxe, were not necessarily the best, but that was pretty much all Pontiac could pretty much offer. And then as the years went on, there were pretty much other models that came along during the 50s and the early 60s, but it actually was during the 1960s that John DeLorean, the same man who founded the DeLorean Motor Company in 1975, had previously worked on the Pontiac division of GM itself. The big thing about John DeLorean's work on Pontiac was a lot of incredible things out there that happened. DeLorean actually went ahead to invent a few new models for Pontiac's entire lineup of vehicles. DeLorean was responsible for the fabrication of the first ever design of the GTO, Firebird, and even the Grand Prix, starting in 1969. And the big thing about DeLorean based on the automotive industry itself during the 60s was a lot of incredible design, safety features, and other accommodations that would indeed become very well known in the industry and also brilliant for the time period. Pontiac, of course, was one of the big parts in playing these new developments and these new inventions that John DeLorean had basically put together, so this way the world could be a whole lot safer when it comes to driving on the roads or otherwise. Pontiac, of course, had a huge legendary status developing and a very, very trendy sort of figure heading through the decades. John DeLorean was so confident that, well, the DeLorean Motor Company had been established in 1975, and in 1981 was when the production of the first ever car for the company itself, the DeLorean DMC-12, had been produced, and then for 2 solid years, 1983, was pretty much how many DeLoreans they made. It ended up ending on its production because of some rather illegal stuff that happened. But in terms of how Pontiac managed to roll on through the ensuing decades throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it pretty much held its own pretty good, actually. There were a lot of other models that had started to become very popular throughout those time periods. There was the new generation Bonneville in the 70s, and then the 80s there came the Fiero GT, and then in the 90s you got yourself the more practical Grand Am and Grand Prix sedans, all of which were pretty well known throughout their time periods. And then in the 2000s, there came along a bunch of other models as well. You got yourself a new Grand Prix, Grand Am, Montana, and then of course there was one of the first ever travesties of the industry thus far. The Aztec. Yeah. A 4-door crossover SUV of some sorts that was absolutely quirky and beyond ugly, according to the majority of people who knew about the vehicle's existence. But the way we see it, it's one of those gems that we happen to find. Doug DeMuro was very ecstatic about it. I myself happened to be very surprised at how much the Aztec itself is capable of, and also what kind of designs, quirks, features, and incredible stylings had pretty much been overlooked because of how much it was hated back then. The truth is, though, a lot of these great things that happened in the industry pretty much came to an end. In the mid to late 2000s, Pontiac had a few other models that they dealt out with as well. The G Series and the Solstice 2-door Roadster. That, of course, still remained one of my most favorite recent Pontiac models, and probably one of my favorite modern-day roadsters from my particular generation. And then, of course, the recession came by and then went, but not before taking a lot of companies with it. And also, millions of homes ended up being foreclosed because of this extreme economic depression that was just as bad as the original Great Depression of the 1930s. So, of course, Pontiac is now officially history, along with Hummer, Mercury, and actually a few others in mind as well. May it rest in peace. So the thing about Pontiac nowadays is that, well, a lot of us can probably only imagine how it would have thrived if it were still around today. I could probably only imagine the new generation Firebird and Fiero probably being similar to that of, well, maybe the Camaro and, I guess, any particular 2-door Roadster pretty much with a convertible rooftop. If the Solstice were to be remade, I would probably expect it to look similar to that of maybe the Ferrari FF, just with 2 doors instead of, well, 4 pretty much. Pretty similar, but I guess not necessarily as much. But again, imagination probably ain't gonna solve much. So, feels great to remember this kind of stuff, but now we just have to let it go, as it's all now history. So, you know what? I'm probably going to talk about yet another now defunct automotive manufacturer tomorrow. And the thing is, well, I'm probably going to be on the roll here considering the many others that I might also have to talk about throughout the next few weeks. But if you want to see more, go down to my channel. Then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.